Hello and welcome to episode 1 of People Behind Politics. This is a new podcast with a mission to explore the experiences of those advisors, aides, assistants, speechwriters, spads and pads who work for a range of politicians or political parties. My name is James Matthewson and I previously worked for Parliament as a spokesperson and communications representative for the chair of the Labour Party. However, during this series I'll be maintaining my political neutrality so that you, the listener, can hear from a diverse range of former and current political staffers from across the political spectrum. Please do subscribe so that you don't miss any of our weekly episodes, and make sure to follow us on all of the relevant social media platforms. Now, I'm very excited to introduce our first guest of the series, Polly Mackenzie. Polly worked as a special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, and is now the chief executive of the think tank Demos. Polly was at the centre of the coalition government and helped to draw up the coalition agreement between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and I can't wait to hear all of the fascinating experiences I'm sure she's had working in politics. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and thanks for listening. Polly Mackenzie, welcome to People Behind Politics. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Polly, as I mentioned in your introduction, is a former special advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, and you're currently the chief executive of the cross-party think tank Demos. Am I saying that right? Is it Demos? Is it Demos? Is it Demos?
It's ancient Greek, mate. Say it how you like.
A
micron, let's call the whole thing off.
Yeah, do you know what it is? It's all Greek to me either way. So
yes, anyway, I say demos, but I'm not going to,
Well, we're going to say Demos. If you say Demos, I'll say Demos.
Yeah, but maybe I'm just posh. Who knows?
Well, you're the chief executive, mate, so we'll go with what you say.
Okay.
You started your career as a business journalist, is that right?
I did, yes, on a magazine called Property Week.
Oh, fantastic. And then you segued into politics, first working for Ed Davey as a policy advisor on housing and local government. And it's a strange one, actually. I was thinking about this before you came on, and when you agreed to do the episode, which we're very grateful for, I was thinking, I know I've met Polly before, and you won't remember this, but the last time we met was backstage at a recording of Question Time in, I think it was Bishop Auckland. And I was there at the time working for the chair of the Labour Party in Lavery, and the Tories had Jacob Rees-Mogg on. I think Richard Tice was there. Do you remember that episode?
No, yeah. It was Rod Liddle.
Rod Liddle was there as well. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the journalist Rod Liddle was there.
That his hair is like nicotine stained. I think that's quite remarkable. Like nicotine stained teeth, nicotine stained fingernails. That's like old school. Nicotine stained hair, that is absolutely, that is commitment to
absolutely
cigarettes.
And I mean, I can't say much for fear of reprisal, but I did notice that Ron Liddle consumed quite a lot of the beverages that were on offer.
But you've got to reclaim your license fee, you see. That's the thing.
Exactly.
I do in the green room at Newsnight, there's a little tiny fridge. And sometimes they have Coca-Cola in there. So you've always got to check in order to reclaim a small smidgen of your license fee and take one.
Yeah. I had visions of Phil stuffing his pockets with olives and canapes and all sorts of, to get his money's worth of being there. But what I remember distinctly from that was that we'd arrived I think an hour before or something. I think there was a threat of a protest, if I remember, as we were in a kind of election fever at the time. And Jacob Rees-Mogg's reading, I might have embellished this slightly in my mind, but Jacob Rees-Mogg's reading some kind of ancient tome with his legs crossed in the corner, and everyone's, kind of silent in the room. And it's about 15 minutes before due to start, and you'd been delayed because of trains, I think.
Oh, yes. Yes. So the train had been cancelled, and so they'd sent they'd sent someone to pick me up in like sort of a taxi, but really just a giant van. And he looked a bit like Have you ever watched the show Dog the Bounty Hunter?
Yes,
So
yeah,
basically,
yeah.
like this sort of
Yeah, the long blonde hair.
yeah, long hair, like beaten up old van, basically. And he drove me like an hour and a half from wherever it was. I don't
Oh
know,
my god!
Leeds or somewhere. It was
Because
very strange.
you came bursting. I remember on the phone. You said hello to everyone. I'm thinking to myself, I'm thinking, Christ, it's the first time I've been backstage at something like Question Time. I mean, Question Time's a very, very adversarial kind of
Mhm.
thing. You don't know how people are going to be with each other. You said hello to everyone. Everyone was chatting in general, and the kind of general friendliness that happens. Even Rod Little was smiling.
Yeah.
Everyone was kind of being friendly. And then I'm thinking to myself, like, you've got 10 minutes before you're going on this show, which is so notorious for all this stuff, and you were like, kind of rushing in the door, getting ready, all the rest of it. And then when you went on to do the recording, I'm sitting looking, I'm thinking, why does she look so calm and collected? That's not normal. That can't be right. How can you've literally just 10 minutes before this has started. And then obviously I realised that's the nature of somebody who's just been in a coalition government and been an advisor, deputy prime minister in your experience, because just being able to be calm and think, right, okay, what we doing? I've got 10 minutes. Let's do this. Was pretty impressive, I must say.
Well, that's very kind. It all blurs into one, I think.
Yeah, it's a pretty, I can imagine, pretty hectic time. Especially, I think you were chief executive of Demos then. But where did politics start for you? Like, were you politically active as a student, or at a particularly young age, or anything like that?
No, I mean, I have a clear recollection of staying up with my dad to watch the '92 general election, and
Mm.
him being very depressed. Um, but beyond that, like, no, not at all. And I remember thinking, like, student politics I found so weird that so I was my JCR president, so like the president of sort of just the college student union.
Okay, yeah.
And I went down to the whole university student union a couple of times, but there was suddenly talk about Palestine. I'm like, who do you think you are? Like, you're just a bunch of students who know nothing about anything and have absolutely no impact. And they were like, we think we should write an open letter to Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm like, he doesn't give a damn about you, you
Yeah, yeah,
weirdos. You're supposed to be
yeah,
worrying about. Like, so I guess I had thought of um, student union politics, at least, as being about more like like being the trade union for your
yeah, yeah.
students, for,
On behalf
your
of the
peers
students,
on
yeah,
behalf of the students against the college, or to I don't know, get a new payphone installed, or to care about rents and those kinds of issues. But it struck me as weird. I was not
these
interested in politics.
big kind of theoretical debates about kind of foreign policy and all sorts of things like that were just kind of, yeah,
Yeah,
what
I
are we
mean,
doing this for?
yeah, and obviously you should never tell people to not be interested in politics or in the world. So I'm just being kind of smug, really, but as if I'm better and they're not. That's absolutely not what I think now with reflection. It's just that was my thought at the time. It's just like, we are nobody. We're a bunch of like 19-year-olds who know nothing.
Hmm.
And it was the arrogance, really, with which they thought that they were important, I guess, that
Yeah,
I found a bit alienating. So I just wanted to be a journalist, really. And
yeah.
but I did. Basically, I got the policy, the tax policy, planning policy beat as a reporter at Property Week, and I thought, oh well,
Okay.
maybe so. Policy is fun. Policy is interesting. I want to be a political journalist. Um,
Yeah.
and so my plan was to just kind of work in politics for a few months through the general election, 2004 to 2005, and then ideally go back to political writing. And I remember being
Okay. Yeah.
turned down for a job at the Yorkshire Post, turned down for a job at the is it the Journal, the Newcastle paper?
Oh yeah, up to the Chronicle and the Journal.
Chronicle,
Yeah,
one of
they're
them.
kind of like sister papers. Yeah.
I don't remember which one it was, but anyway. And I was like, well, maybe if I've got some experience in politics, I will be able to kind of make that transition. But then I went
Hmm.
into politics, and I just sort of forgot to leave.
It's nice to hear you say that. I think people will be reassured hearing you say that, because often people look back upon reflection of their career and what have not, and you get a very polished version of this and that. But I think it's always reassuring when you hear people say, "I got turned down for this" or "I got turned down for that," because often people who are there'll be people listening to this. I hope anyone's listening to it, but if there's people listening to this who are aspiring for a certain trajectory in their career, or want to work in politics, or want to work in journalism or media or whatever it is, and they're having those frustrations, they're coming up against those knockbacks or whatever. It can be quite frustrating when you hear everyone, they hear the people who've made it saying, "Oh well, then I went here, and then I went here, and then I went here," and I don't think anyone's story is that straightforward. So it's nice to hear you honestly saying it's not as clear cut a journey.
I've been turned down for a lot of jobs, don't worry.
And you then, so from that time, did you say it was Property Magazine, was it?
Property Week
magazine. So from the time there, you end up working for Ed Davey. Is there any particular reason Ed was that just a job that came up, or the Lib Dems kind of, I'm guessing, politically aligned with your views generally, but were the Lib Dems were you a member of the Lib Dems? Was there any particular focus on them for any particular reason?
Well, I also, would you believe, went for a job interview with Geoffrey Clifton Brown, the Cotswold MP.
Oh wow, okay.
But I was slightly off put because he also didn't offer me the job, crucially, but probably saw through my lily-livered liberal politics. But they had a Bush, not him, but whoever kind of was in the adjoining office had a big Bush poster up. And I was a bit like,
oh, right, okay.
It's not very well being a Conservative, but being a George Bush supporter, though, of course, we've all learned to love George Bush these days as a substantial improvement and a proper statesman, at least, in comparison with Trump. But that's a whole other story. But no, so I was working on Property Week, which was actually about commercial property, but I went to the Lib Dems as the housing and local government advisor, just sort of pretended that I was working on housing. And I knew anything about housing, nothing about housing. I knew about offices and industrial warehouses and rail freight and real estate investment trusts. But anyway, I winged it through that interview. It was great. So they gave me a quiz. You had to have a quiz to see if you knew anything about the Lib Dems, right? And you had to name 3 Liberal Democrat MPs, and the exclusions were except for Ed Davey, Charles Kennedy, and Lembit Opik. I was like,
right, okay.
Because obviously, if you hadn't heard of Ed Davey, given that he was about to interview you, bit of a loser. Charles Kennedy, Lembit Opik,
probably shouldn't have the job.
Proper famous, celebrity. And so, but I couldn't think of any. So I just Googled it, but they put me at a desk with a computer. So I was like, well, this is me showing my enterprising research capabilities. I am gonna Google it. So I Googled it and I found the names of 3. I went really obscure, Alan Beath, Ricky Younger Ross.
Alan Beath was my MP growing up. So Lord Beath as he now is, but Alan was my MP. He used to do slight deviation here, but he used to take a camper van around the hills of Northumberland and do his surgeries in it.
Oh, good for him.
Which I thought was fascinating. So Beath, obscure choice at the time for you to choose, but obviously a very astute.
Well, I was trying to show off. You see.
MP.
If you've cheated, you want to proper cheat.
Oh, you want to go fully in for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think I put Roger Williams as well because he was the MP for where my dad lives in Powys. Anyway, so I did that, got through the job interview, but it was around my expertise, and I wasn't working directly for Ed. Technically, I was working for the party as his advisor because he was the housing and local government spokesman, and so as the sort of front benchers got extra policy support to help them with research and policy making, parliamentary questions, that kind of stuff. And so we did a big campaign on local government finance, replacing council tax with local income tax. And did some stuff on planning reform, house building, those kinds of things, all in the run up to the general election.
Awesome. And how did you end up working for Nick Clegg? Because then when you went to work for Nick, you were then you were then with Nick or in post with Nick, I think, for like just shy of 10 years.
Yeah. Also forgot to leave. No. So I was the housing and local government advisor. And, after a 2 or so years of doing housing and local government, you're a bit bored, right? And I'd worked for Sarah Tether after Ed because she was sort of shuffled into that department. Then Andrew Stonnell was about to take over. And I was, and then my colleague Tim was leaving to go live in Italy. And he was the Home Affairs advisor. So I was like, well, I can see that Nick Clegg is going some places. I'm going to get the job as the Home Affairs advisor. So I applied for that job as Tim was leaving. But as my there was the Liberal Democrat ball just in that period where I'd just applied. Liberal Democrat ball, like a bit like the Tory black and white ball, big fundraising thing, but like obviously way lamer and smaller and cheaper.
It's that, it doesn't sound as glamorous somehow.
But it was, and the problem, they like staff obviously aren't going to be giving money, so, but they would sort of give away tickets in the last few days to because they hadn't managed to sell them, which is of course a bad sign if you haven't sold tickets to your fundraising event. But never mind. So I went along and I switched the table around the place settings so that I could sit next to Nick. Snuck into the room in advance,
This story of your political career and your trajectory is one of sabotage so far.
Well, I'm trying to give tips, right?
Manipulation.
This is for people who want to get ahead in politics. I'm not.
Yeah.
It
is a realistic take.
Yeah, you've got to make your own way in the world.
Absolutely.
So I snuck into the room, moved the place settings around so I could sit next to him, and then we had an argument about whether mayors were an appropriate model of local government.
All right, okay. It was a good way to start dinner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it wasn't. I mean, we wasn't come to fisticuffs or anything.
No.
We had a deep debate. So that was the first time I met Nick. Was there, and then had a job interview. Probably, I don't know, a week later or whatever, and they gave me the job. So I ended up working for him in that role as Shadow Home Secretary. And then essentially, you know how like in the civil service, you're not allowed to work on elections?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, so in the Liberal Democrats, if you are a party staff member, you're not allowed to work on a leadership election or an internal election.
Yeah. Okay.
So I had to quit my job in order to work on his leadership election.
All right, okay.
Which was 8 weeks or so. We had the office was based in this like condemned building just opposite St James's Park Tube Station. And so, I mean, it was literally like half the building was falling down, but the other half had been somehow ruled safe. But there were these corridors that were sort of blocked off. You couldn't go down with like yellow tape. Anyway, so it was quite cheap. And so, we somehow made it through those 8 weeks. And then, sort of, I guess, a reward or because I was good, one of the two, they gave me a job in the leader's office once he'd won.
So hired from the campaign into the leadership of the Lib Dems. And then did you, at the time, I'm guessing not, but did you have any inkling of, where this was going? That, I mean, what was the kind of feel like in the Liberal Democrats in the run-up to that? And I mean, obviously that general election campaign in particular, but, where you stand for Nick Clegg. Because I remember Cleggmania. I don't think many people have forgotten Cleggmania. But that spread across the UK pretty quickly. I think it was after that specific TV debate where, Nick had gotten that airtime and, all of a sudden people were like, who's this guy? I like that. I like him. I like the alternative. And all of a sudden it kind of exploded. And then obviously you had the run-up to the coalition being fought. I mean, did you have any inkling that things were going to get that big working for Nick?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was my plan all along. No. Of
course, which is why you shifted the placement round.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no. Look, here's the thing. Like, it's funny. People accuse the Liberal Democrats of all sorts of things. But the weirdest thing to me is people who accuse them of being like hungry for power. Like nobody becomes a Liberal Democrat because they're hungry for power. Nick Clegg could have easily joined the Labour Party or the Conservative Party and been a a cabinet minister, and
Yeah.
that wasn't what drove him. Is he thought that politics should be different, and the same really for everybody who's ever worked there. There are plenty of faults, as do we all, but the fundamental thing is you don't do it because you think you're going to be working in number 10. People for whom that's,
No.
and I don't want to judge people whose motivation is that. It's a perfectly reasonable ambition to have for yourself. But you've got to be a bit stupid to say my main ambition is to be a policy advisor in number 10 Downing Street, and therefore I'm going to join the Liberal Democrats. Well, that suggests that. So,
yeah, that's my route to power.
It was luck. And it was also, bad luck in lots of ways. Obviously, an enormous privilege for me to be able to work alongside someone who I massively admired, at doing good work, being involved at the highest level of government policy, being, fly on the wall to all sorts of big, exciting decisions, all of that. But, I think you have to think about that 2010 general election as essentially being luck. The Liberal Democrats got, almost a couple of million extra votes, but slightly fewer seats. And, you just need to sort of move the needle 0.5% in one direction or the other, and the outcome would have been different. And if David Cameron had won that 2015 majority, that slim majority, just a few votes in 2010, I think the Liberal Democrats would have gone on to enormous success as a much more effective opposition under Nick's leadership than the Labour Party was capable of being.
Do you think further down the line that almost would have come to fruition, probably 2015, something like that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think the Liberal Democrats would continue to grow as a creative, ambitious force in British politics. But, the result was on a different side of the line, which meant that there was... the political professor, Philip Cowley, has talked about it as some sort of chess thing, like a forced move, where you've got to do something, but whatever you do, you'll be in checkmate. And that's where the Liberal Democrats were in 2010, is to say that you are a political party that nevertheless is not that interested in being a government, that's going to destroy you.
Undermines everything that you've set out, doesn't it? Really?
What's the point in voting for you? People accuse the Lib Dems of being a protest vote, but it's no, we actually literally are a protest vote. That would have been a huge call to make that I think would have fatally undermined the Liberal Democrats. Equally, going into coalition with the Labour Party would have fatally undermined the Liberal Democrats, being part of a government of losers, basically, trying to prop up a party that the voters had rejected. But, as history tells us, going into coalition with the Conservative Party fatally wounded the Liberal Democrats as well. Or, maybe they're still alive. Maybe they can come back. Time will tell. But we caused generational harm to the party. And in some ways, I feel immense sense of sadness and sometimes kind of guilt about that, except that there wasn't an alternative. There are lots of small things we could have done better, of course. The biggest is probably tuition fees, but in the end, it's the reality that you decided to go into government with a much bigger party who were totally ruthless at defending their partisan interest, because that's why the Conservative Party is what it is. So it just
hundreds and hundreds of years old, isn't it? It's the most successful political machine on planet Earth, really. So
essentially, yes. Yeah. So I genuinely I don't see what the alternative could have been, because as a minority government run by the Conservatives would have gone back to the country within just a few months, and the party would have been destroyed as well, because it also didn't have any money to fight another general election. So. And you saw the ruthlessness of that squeeze message in 2015, of the idea of in the end, you've got to choose one of the big ones. That's what absolutely destroyed the Lib Dems. Yeah. So, and first past the post is the absolute worst system for an insurgent party, for a third party, unless you are geographically concentrated, obviously like the SNP are.
Yeah.
But
yeah, exactly.
Essentially. pre-2010, the Liberal Democrats were the most successful third party in a first-past-the-post system anywhere in the world. And like by quite a margin, because first-past-the-post just kills alternatives, which is why I don't like it, because I'm, in the end, more than anything, I think I'm a pluralist.
Yeah.
And I think our politics is way too partisan, and it absolutely destroys creativity in the service of ideology. So I think it's immensely sad to have lost that third strong voice from politics.
Yeah, making British politics, which wasn't very plural anyway, but making it a hell of a lot less plural.
Yeah.
And
And there will be people who think that, I've got blood on my hands, small amounts, what that Nick and David Laws and Chris Huhne, all the people who made that decision are sort of are really bad guys who should be ashamed of themselves. But I guess for those people, I think it's just worth thinking about how the alternatives would have played out. Is that by sheer bad luck, the Liberal Democrats, with, in my view, the best leader they'd ever had, ended up in a situation where there were only bad moves.
To catch-22, yeah. I that's the whole purpose of this podcast, really, is to kind of get that, to be able to get these stories out and get people's experiences across, because regardless of, everybody has a view on the coalition government, everybody has a view on largely everything that happens in politics, but very removed from the people who are involved in it. And people don't think about the people behind the scenes. People especially are, shadowy, people like yourself are shadowy individuals who, obviously have some kind of evil plan for world dominance and all the rest of it. And that's often the way that, that people who work in politics are portrayed. What was it like at that time in coalition government for you as an individual? I mean, were your personal views challenged? Were, because you helped draw up that coalition agreement, and was that, what was it like? I mean, other than the workload, which I can imagine was phenomenal, did you have time for a work-life balance at all? What was the personal experience for you at that time?
What, specifically around the coalition agreement?
Yeah, well, specifically around going into coalition, setting that up, those coalition years that followed as well. Like, that was the first British coalition government since World War II. And, these were historic moments, but at the time, did it feel that momentous, or did it feel like, this is something we just need to get through? This is our work. This is my work. What was your life like at that time? Because I think one of the things people are quite interested in knowing is, what is the impact on somebody's personal life, their home life? Like, were you able to get any time away from that at all? I mean, it must have been absolutely hectic.
Well, yeah. So the worst, the negotiation process was exhausting and came off the back of an election period that had been obviously very intensive, like starting at, there was sort of 6 a.m. meeting that you had to be in for. And, people worked late. You just, in an election, you've just absolutely got to be on top of the next thing. And there'd been obviously this wall of hatred unleashed against Nick by, the powers that be in the national media, which had been shed loads of work done. And then suddenly you're going into one of the most difficult negotiations. But you do it on adrenaline. I remember one, like I was leaving at like 2 a.m, that probably the day after the election, possibly the day after that, I don't really know. But I booked a taxi for the morning to bring me back in again for 6 a.m. Then I'm standing outside my flat at 5:30 in the morning, like looking for this stupid taxi which hasn't arrived. And then I realised it's because I booked it for the next day. Because I'd booked it at 2 when I was trying to book it for like basically 3 hours from now. But I was like, okay, I want a taxi tomorrow. So
Yeah.
that's, level of brain fog quite high. And we didn't have a lot of sleep, but it obviously wasn't just me. There was both the politicians and then range of kind of brilliant colleagues. And essentially there was the sort of the 3 days were around agreeing kind of heads of terms, really, like all of the big difficult things like green investment bank and the pupil premium and the AV referendum. And that was, a kind of a couple of hours of meetings and then, producing papers, looking at all of the options. There was obviously talks with the Labour Party. I didn't sit in on any of that. But that was kind of totally exhausting. And then finally agreed at sort of midnight or something at a meeting of the parliamentary parties of the Liberal Democrats, which was exhilarating. And then there was this really extraordinary moment. My colleague Chris, who was the Treasury advisor, got a call from the Treasury to talking about anti-forestalling measures, because we'd just announced an increase in capital gains tax in the coalition agreement. And normally, right, a government would never plans for announcing tax rises, because if the tax is going to go up, people will sell their assets to avoid the tax rise. But coalition agreements don't follow the rules of government announcements. So they were a bit like, oh, can you come to a meeting to talk about anti-forestalling measures? And it was a bit like, and that was, I guess, the moment for both of us where it dropped of like, oh man, this is like actually real. Like we're making laws here.
This is we have power.
So then there had to be a special conference of the Liberal Democrats, and I didn't go to that because I just went home to sleep. Then I was there to meet Nick the next day in Downing Street. And then essentially over that weekend, me and a guy called James O'Shaughnessy, he's now Lord O'Shaughnessy, we sat through with some civil servants writing the full coalition agreement together, going through basically both manifestos, line by line, like, you want to do this, you want to do this, what should we do, what can we agree to, which then went back up to the principals to...
It's literally a case of sitting with those manifestos and saying...
Yeah, literally, sentence
compare and contrast, and then what can we get in? Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was... that was a weekend. And I think I went to see my brother for dinner or something like that, which felt really, really weird to just speak to a normal human being about normal things when I'd been like sitting in Downing Street writing government policy, for the first time ever.
Yeah.
I mean, more broadly, it was... So this is tricky because I did work very hard, and that recently, Dominic Cummings, who when he was advertising for People, talked about the fact that you won't have a work-life balance, you'll never see your family, all of that.
Was this when he wanted weirdos? Was it that he was?
That's the one. And he kind of, and there was a sort of machismo about it, a celebration of the fact that you basically got to be a psychopath to work in politics.
Yeah.
And very relaxed about it. If you watch The West Wing, there's a bit in The West Wing where Leo McGarry is talking to his wife, and he says, "This is the most important job I'll ever do," and she says, "Not more important than your marriage," and he says, "Right now, yes, it is."
Yeah.
And I think for Dominic, his point is that if you don't want to be that guy, that's totally fine, but you don't belong here.
Yeah.
And I think this is a real problem, because he's kind of right that is what it's like in politics, right? So just to give you a couple of examples, I got married the autumn of 2010 and then went on my honeymoon audaciously. So I was off for 2.5 weeks or whatever.
Wow.
I came back and the spending review was finished, or pretty much finished, and huge decisions had been made with, of course, no reference to me because I wasn't there.
Yeah.
And in my view, some certainly things that I would have spoken up against had been decided, and it was far too late to unpick. So you realise that actually if you're not in the room where it happens, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So if you want to have impact, you need to find a way to be there. There's then also, and this is kind of more sort of great sadness for me, but is that I did work for Nick for a decade, but I slowly became less and less connected to him and worked less and less closely with him. And it's partly because I took 2 periods of maternity leave.
Okay. Yeah.
And again, everything's moving so fast. So it's not a complaint about Nick, really. It's just it's the reality. It's if
But
you're not
if you take even a week, the amount of things that have happened in that time politically,
and so feelings have moved on, relationships have moved on. There's the conversations you missed, and they're what the question that I sort of puzzle over is whether it was possible for it to be different. Because I and a couple of other women who took maternity leave all came back to essentially finding that our jobs were being done by somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a couple of guys who took sabbaticals who came back to promotions. So, maybe there's just some patriarchy in there. But I think there probably is, all of this stuff that Marianne Seacott has written very compellingly about recently about the authority gap of like when a woman says what she thinks, she's seen as aggressive and a man is seen as assertive.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can literally behave in the same way and be considered a troublemaker. And I think there's lots and lots of offices that really struggle with that. It's absolutely not unique to the Liberal Democrats. You look at, probably 70% of special advisors at the moment are men in the Conservative Party. So, and that's where I think in the end we have to find a way to do politics differently, because there is a huge cost to losing people. And I don't mean losing me because I'm so special. I mean losing people who have lives and caring commitments and elderly parents or their own disabilities or their own mental health conditions. It's if those people aren't allowed to be part of the behind the scenes politics.
And those very people are probably, they're probably the ones with a huge amount of personal insight to bring to the role on a huge range of issues. And you are missing that as well.
It's a bit... There's a lot of criticism from, current government, I guess, for fruit farmers who just pull for the easy lever of let's hire easy, cheap people from Eastern Europe who'll live on the farm and not have anything complicated in their lives that stops them from picking 1,000 strawberries an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you can understand why any sensible fruit farmer wants to pull the easy lever. And you can understand why a prime minister in the end or any senior politician, given that the people do exist in the world, why wouldn't you just surround yourself with slightly psychopathic people driven by ambition who are going to be there 18 hours a day and do anything you ask them to, have absolutely no personal boundaries?
Because at the end of the day, I guess, as a politician, and especially a prime minister, a deputy prime minister, it's your life, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've given up everything for that. And you would not maybe expect the same of your staff, but it's certainly going to be a hell of a lot easier if your staff are doing the same, and don't have commitments.
And that's why I have sort of sympathy really for those ministers, including those who I served, who find nursery drop-off and other levels of complexity difficult to deal with. It's just that in the end, you have to find a way, to hire local people on your fruit farm. And you have to find a way to bring diversity of personalities into these political roles. If you only have 25-year-old, psychotically ambitious young men and women with nothing else to do with their lives, there is a long-term cost to that. There is a huge impact on the quality of the advice, the quality of the work, and the depth of your understanding. It's not okay, even though it's understandable. It's not okay to, in the end, have the same people advising the same kinds of prime ministers all the time. When I was in number 10, we recruited this joint policy unit to work for the prime minister and deputy prime minister, and the civil service controlled the recruitment process. So it's like, I'm saying that because it's like officially not my fault, Gov. Nine people were hired. There was 3 old Etonians and only 1 woman. Like that's the
9. Christ.
And the only reason we got the woman to hire was because a senior civil service colleague was just like, I'm not putting up with this, and went and found a brilliant person who was on maternity leave and just begged her to put her name forward as to come back to this at the end of her maternity leave. But it's totally self-reinforcing, because if you have a culture in Downing Street which is shouting and throwing things at walls and staying late and using each other as your drinking buddies, and then why would anybody else want to work there if you've got to explain that actually, in order to pick up your mum from the dementia daycare, you need to leave at 2 on Thursdays,
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
You just
And
wouldn't do
you
it. And I think it's a huge cost to our politics. And so you just have to find ways to force yourselves to do it differently. And it's tough for ministers, because they are they put so much of themselves into their political lives at often vast personal cost. But I don't know, we just got to find a way to do things differently.
That's it. And I think it goes the same in, not just in Parliament or in government, but in political parties, because a lot of people, like you say, the kind of person you've described, that kind of, ruthless 25-year-old with nothing else going on, who's there to be, ambitious and all the rest of it and cutthroat. Those individuals have a very, short sell-by date at the end of the day. Like, they go on to do something else within, and the burnout in politics within 5 years. Like they're not really there for the long haul a lot of the time, because, they don't, they go on to other things, or the land at some PR firm or whatever it is, because, they think, oh God, actually, I'm not putting up with that, or the money's not what they want, or, they've got their foot on the ladder where they want to go. So, it's counterintuitive, and it doesn't really always work to the benefit of government anyway at all, let alone the fact that it's not representative of society and the reality of life. And you're not going to have, if your advice is coming from people who are very far removed from reality. I mean, I remember one of my experiences chatting with someone when I was in the House of Commons, probably second or third time. I was in Portcullis House and I was talking to someone, and he said, this lad introduced me to another chap who had a double-breasted jacket on and whatever. And, and I thought, this is a Tory. It's a Tory. I've read about them. I've come south and I've read about them. I know what they look like. And he started talking to us. He says, which one did you go to? Which, Oxford or Cambridge? And I hadn't even been at university. And I was like, no, neither. And I was trying to explain. He was like, what are you doing here then? So I turned my head. I go, well, this Tory, like, you seen him? He turned around. He went, oh no, he's one of ours. He's in the Labour Party. Thinking like, what? That's what people in the Labour Party in London dress like. And it was just this total. But that my conception that was the standard, but actually, again, he wasn't representative of any particular group. It was just this standard kind of cut-out character that you would find wandering around Westminster. He was young, male, and white, and and it was just like all over the place. People were like that, and there was just that complete lack of diversity. I think when people say diversity, people get a very specific idea of what people mean, but it's a huge range of diversity, isn't it? If you're not having people who are making policy or advising on policy who are impacted by that, whether it be disability, whether it be, their parents are in care homes, their parents have got dementia, whatever it be, they're not going to fully understand those issues.
I completely agree. And yeah, on the one hand, there's people who think diversity means absolutely just visible diversity, even though that's important. But there's also some people who still think it's literally about like having someone from Durham as well as Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah.
And I find like I still know of people who, if they're recruiting, they do the sift by they put the Oxford and Cambridge CVs in one pile and then they junk the others. And you just think, what is, like, you're outsourcing recruitment to the admissions tutors of these universities. Like, what's wrong with you? Anyway.
And ironically, it's the opposite of meritocracy, really, which is which is what's so espoused by a lot of these characters. But after you've you've done the coalition government. You've survived it. You were the director of policy to the deputy prime minister from 2010 to 2015. At the end of that, how did you feel? Did you
Well,
you know
obviously, having been ejected by the voters, me and my
yeah
colleagues mostly just felt very sad, and we drank an awful lot of wine. But after that, um, after that, uh, yeah, I think it's really tricky to know what to do in terms of like life after politics, actually,
hmm
because especially if your party's just been obliterated, right? Like, you're not wanted. There's lots of routes for ex-special advisors into like public affairs and corporate affairs and all of that, but like the point is partly because of who you know,
yeah
only partly, but still. So if there's a whole bunch of um like conservative special advisors out there, like no one's going to give a Lib Dem a job. Like, why would you? So
yeah
that said, and also of course lots and lots of ex-Liberal Democrat MPs also on the jobs market, and it just was really difficult for so many of us to find something to do with kind of the next phase of our lives. And so I had a sort of rebound boyfriend, as it were, and Sandy Toksvig during the election campaign had like launched a women's equality party. So
yes.
I had her email address like of old because she'd once helped Nick Clegg to write jokes for his speech or something.
All
And I
right.
emailed her, I was like, you've got to let me run this. I'll run it. It'll be fine. And so I went and I helped them to basically set up the kind of the operations of the party.
Yeah.
I did that for 3 or 4 months, which was good. I really liked the idea of trying to be a non-partisan political party, just sort of come at politics sideways
Yeah.
and say, do you know what, everybody should be a feminist. It should be like a hygiene factor. And
hmm
so the goal was to put themselves out of business by making all of the other parties properly feminist. And they've sort of diverted from that a bit, in my view, very sadly, to just be sort of Marxist feminist tradition. But
Yeah.
equally, there's no harm in having a feminist political party in our politics, you know. So I did that for a few months, but then and then I was incredibly lucky, really, of having this sort of existing relationship of sorts with Martin Lewis, the money saving expert.
Yes.
I just got him in to ask for policy advice on consumer affairs and tuition fees, a bunch of different kind of stuff over the years,
Which
including
would have been a
mental
pretty
health,
smart
actually.
move because he hadn't. That would have been the first time he had been involved really in talking to governments. I mean, you see where he's gone
Well, not
now.
quite. I think he'd been invited in a couple of times by Labour, but yeah, we'd
Oh,
spoken to him in
right. Okay.
opposition. We spoke to, yeah, we brought like, and I really like the guy. I think he's a
Yeah.
fantastic kind of contributor to our public life. And he was like, "Oh yeah, I want to set up a policy institute. Do you want to do it?" So I said, "Oh, okay, cool." Like I didn't have anything sensible like a job interview. He just sort of sent me away for a couple of months to figure out what to do, like what's the theory of change, like how you're going to have impact in the world.
Yeah.
And then gave us a kind of annual grant, and I set that up to try and break this sort of perennial link between financial difficulties and mental health problems. And I sort of love Martin for being the kind of philanthropist who wants to invest in policy and sort of systems thinking, of recognizing you've got these two issues that are linked, that feed each other, that are so hard to extricate. And how can you make changes that slowly help to break that link so that people with mental health problems are no more likely to have financial difficulties than anybody else?
Yeah.
And real deep policy thinking, but then also campaigning and advocacy to get stuff to change. And it was an amazing kind of privilege and opportunity, again, to go from being in government where I was like, knew a little bit about absolutely everything as a generalist advisor, kind of covering the whole
Yeah.
seafront, to then saying, do you know what, I'm really going to specialize. As I'm going to just do this. This is one really big problem, but it's only one problem, and I'm just going to fix it.
Were you able
Um,
to hyper focus on that
yeah,
area?
and that was
Yeah.
really, really good. Then I had my third child, and I was about to go back to money mental health after maternity leave, and then this opportunity came up at Demos, and Demos has always been my favourite think tank,
hmm
and it was And it just sort of had slightly fallen into the doldrums, really, of not really having a mission or a purpose or any political impact. And I wanted to change that, and make a stand for a kind of politics and a kind of policy making that I think has massively fallen out of favour
Yeah.
over the last decade, as we have gone into this extraordinarily partisan era. And it's precisely not what we need. It's the opposite of what we need, if we're to kind of come together to deal with vast, accelerating change on every front that government and policymakers just can't keep up with. So that's what we're trying to do. But
And have you found that? I mean, obviously, it's complete. I imagine it's a completely different pace to having been in politics and all the rest of it. Do you find that a much more? Have you found it more rewarding? Have you found it more challenging? Like, how has it been in contrast to the political life that you had beforehand?
well, so I think everybody who leaves politics will tell you that everything is slower,
Yeah,
and I everything I've done since then has been slow to me, and yet the criticism I get from others is, why are you moving so fast? So I remember when I was running Money and Mental Health, I was based out of the King's Policy Institute, because we were renting some office space from them. And the director of that, Jennifer Rubin, I'd bump into her in the corridor, and she'd ask how things were going, and I'd say, "Oh yeah, we just published it on the paper." She's like, "But you just published a paper 3 weeks ago." I'm like, "Yeah, because now we've done the next one." And it's like academic timescales are obviously very different from think tank
yeah,
timescales, and so that sense of actually you can what can you do if you've only got a week feels slow, when in politics the answer is, it's like, what can you do if you've only got 15 minutes?
exactly. Yeah,
But it's challenging because it's also a completely different skill set. It's not just that fast is better, because it's really not often. If you actually can't be strategic and you can't think long term if you're always thinking about the next wave of the news cycle.
Mm.
And having been trained in that sense of like what good looks like is the ability to make a judgment in 15 minutes and execute, then thinking about like how over the course of 2 years, and am I going to build a coalition of 50 different organizations and slowly
Yeah.
build my trustees' understanding of a complex, like all of that. Like, I had to learn all of that after being a chief executive, as it were.
It's more time to kind of not to strategize, I guess, but have that long term thinking rather than just
And
reactionary minute to minute.
exactly. And the reality is that a life in politics does not train you to work in business.
Yeah,
I mean, it's also true that working in business or charities doesn't train you for politics, which is its own problem. But that you just sort of have to be humble, actually, about recognizing how little you know about how to do things in this different environment. But that's the biggest thing, is just that sense of speed, is that everything will always feel slow if you've ever worked in politics.
yeah,
I remember, like, actually, like really early on in Demos, like, I don't know, first couple of weeks or something, there's a project I knew nothing about. It had nothing to do with it. And somebody sent me a draft press release for a report that was going to come out in a month. I'm like, what? Because literally, like, for me, a press release was something that you did and then you sent it. Like,
it's going out on the day. Yeah,
it was like, well, that's what, so the 2005 general election, my first experience in politics, was like something would happen. I'd call up Ed Davey, who was campaigning in Kingston. I'd be like, this has happened. I think we should say something along these lines. And he'd give me a quote, and then we'd issue a press release. So like the idea that you would draft something that far in advance, and a lot of it is waste, right? Like people do in lots of businesses just spend that, the work expands to meet the time available, right? And so people
yeah,
just end up going round and round and round, and it's really, really boring. But that doesn't mean that fast is always better, because often it's not.
absolutely. That's absolutely fascinating, and thank you for taking the time to talk us through everything. Before I'll let you go and get back to that slightly slower pace, but albeit hectic life. I want to just ask briefly if you had an opportunity to tell somebody who is thinking about working in politics, whether that be for an MP, backbench, front bench, working in government, working with government or opposition, what would be your key piece of advice? And it is a difficult question, but what would be one key piece of advice you would give them?
Move the name place signs in order to get close to the... No.
Do what has to be done.
So much of it is about relationships. And here's the thing. I think when I was at the Women's Equality Party, we had a press officer who was really talented and insightful. But she couldn't get the principals who were actually doing the talking to the journalists to listen to them, to her. And what struck me was really interesting. I remember talking it through with her and realizing that so much, especially the way people learn at university or in like kind of academic routes, is absolutely that you really think that the skill that's needed is being right. And it's actually not. Actually, there's lots of people out there who have good judgment. The hard part is being listened to and building up the relationship that enables you to be listened to. I'm a more sort of familiar example to people, maybe like on The Apprentice, which I really miss because of the pandemic. But anyway, so every so often, like somebody in the boardroom, one of the contestants will say, I knew it would go wrong. I said we shouldn't do it. And Alan Sugar is like never impressed by that.
Yeah.
Because what they're saying is I had the right judgment. And essentially his comeback is, so what you're saying is you were right and you were still ignored. Well, that's the worst. That's the last thing I want to hear. And I think it's so, like, I think it's important in all walks of life, but it's especially important in politics, is people think that being right is what matters. And it's really not. It's about, can you be listened to? Can you be heard? Are you trusted? And that's about building up relationships, and it's about framing, and it's about not always just being an arrogant so-and-so who thinks that they're right all the time. Because actually,
foster those relationships first, and then you can have that influence after.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, Polly. Polly Mackenzie, thank you for coming and talking to people behind politics.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to People Behind Politics. I've been your host, James Matthewson, and I'd like to thank our producer, Charlie Hornsby. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can access the latest weekly episodes as and when they're released. Thanks for listening.